In an earlier video I mentioned Bonfire Night and Guy Fawkes and promised to tell of my connection to Guy Fawkes. This was some time ago. I got a bit distracted with other subjects, but thought it only fair to get back to it and to tell of my connection. It was a bit of a false cliffhanger because it isn't a true biological or historical connection, but a connection nevertheless. For the full details of Guy Fawkes and the gunpowder plot, I'd suggest you looking it up on the web, unless you want me to recount the story for you. I'm not a historian, so I'd just be giving a summary of it anyway. The English, of course, have no problem with it, but in quick summary for Americans, in 1605 Guy Fawkes was caught under the House of Parliament, not the current building, an earlier reincarnation. He was caught all ready to blow up the House of Parliament the next day. This was at the time when there were great infighting between the Catholics and the Protestants. He was allied with the Catholic side. He was caught, tortured, gave away the names of his co-conspirators, and was sentenced to be hung, drawn and quartered. He actually avoided this by jumping off the scaffold and breaking his neck. The interesting part is that every year on November the 5th, the anniversary of his capture, there's large bonfires and Guy Fawkes is burnt in effigy. This has somehow escaped the era of political correctness, but then again, Britain is more of a nation, and so you don't get the infighting between the Catholics and the Protestants as in times past. One can only wonder though what would happen if the effigy of Guy Fawkes was substituted, for instance, for one of Muhammad. There would probably be at least an attempt at the start of World War III, but that's all hypothetical. I've listed in the box of description the various addresses to go to. Now, my connection with Guy Fawkes, to get back on track, is that my parents spent the first night of their honeymoon in the same residence as where Guy Fawkes was born. This was before going on to Edinburgh. Became a bit of a family in-joke that they always thought of me at that time of year, because they were married in November and I was born in August. I'll leave you to do the math yourself. So that's my connection with Guy Fawkes. Seeing as I decided to make this video also basically a prequel, the next address to type in would be 11 Gledhow Wood Road, Leeds. This was the house where my mother's parents were living. When you go looking for it, Google Maps may not take you directly to it. It tends to show up the houses on the opposite side of the street. So you have to look for the house on the left side on the map, in other words on the west, you'll see some houses that are slightly lower than the others. These were built probably late 1950s. My grandparents' house is to the right of these, and if you zoom in close enough to the right hand side of the door, you can actually see the number 11. I was rather amazed when I came across this last year, because I haven't been in that neighbourhood since probably 1964. And they say childhood memories will change, etc., but I could wander around that neighbourhood just like it was yesterday. Even the house looks pretty much the same. The only difference being there's no side gate anymore, and the pear tree which stood in front of the garage slightly to the left has been cut down. But everything else has remained the same pretty much. Even the yellow privet in the garden. I don't know if that's because of some sort of neighbourhood preservation order, or people are just very conservative. But that was the house anyway that my grandparents were living in, and legend has it that my grandmother was out shopping. My father telephoned my grandfather to announce my arrival. He prepared a banner that said "Richard's arrived," and that was what greeted my grandmother when she arrived home. The next address in the prequel is the house where my father's parents were living in 1950. This was just after he had sold his shop and gone there to retire, although he did continue to work for a few more years. In both cases, with Leeds and Willaston, I'm going to include some more videos wandering around the area and giving some recount of my experiences there. The address, as you'll see listed, is Croft End, Willaston. The Google Street Map will take you probably pointing at the house to the left, whereas they were living in the house at the right. You just have to move a little along the street in a westerly direction. No real stories came out of the announcement of my arrival at that time. I'm sure as grandparents they were very delighted with the arrival of their first grandchild. And again, I spent many happy times visiting that house, and that was also the house in which I recounted the story of where my grandfather would point out the owls to me at the bottom of the garden. Well, that basically is the prequel. As with all the series of videos, I'll continue to embellish on stories based on feedback, but I have quite a bit that I could recount as well, so don't worry. And I hope now that that answers the question of my connection with Guy Fawkes.